Hello, and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Imagine a boy whose formal education ended before he turned 12. A boy who never attended college, never studied law, never received the classical training that marked gentlemen of his age. A boy whose prospects were so modest that his only career path was measuring land for wealthy planters. Now picture that same boy becoming the commander of an army, fighting the most powerful empire on earth. Picture him holding that ragged army together through winters of starvation and summers of defeat. Picture him refusing to become a king when his soldiers offered him a crown. Picture him voluntarily surrendering absolute power not once but twice, walking away from authority that other men would have killed to keep. This is the story of George Washington, a man who should have been forgotten by history, relegated to a footnote as a provincial surveyor or perhaps a minor military officer. Instead, he became what one eulogist called first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Every dollar bill in your wallet bears his face. The capital of the United States carries his name. An entire state on the opposite coast honors his memory. The Washington Monument stands at the heart of American power. More places, more institutions, more children have been named for George Washington than perhaps any other American who ever lived. How did this happen? How does a boy with no formal education become a general? How does a general with more losses than victories become a national hero? How does a slaveholder from Virginia become the symbol of a revolution fought for liberty? The answer reveals not just the character of one remarkable man, but the nature of leadership itself, the terrible weight of duty, and what it costs to build something that will outlast your own life. But to understand how George Washington became the father of a nation, we must first understand the world into which he was born, a world of tobacco and slavery, of British rule and colonial ambition, of a Virginia plantation system that would shape everything he became. Before we begin this journey through the life of America's first and perhaps greatest president, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm always curious where in the world you're watching from tonight, so leave a comment and let me know. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away as we travel back to colonial Virginia, to a modest plantation on the northern neck, where on a cold February morning in 1732, a child was born who would change the course of human history. The world of colonial Virginia. The Virginia of George Washington's birth was not yet America. It was a British colony, one of 13 clinging to the eastern seaboard of a vast continent that stretched west into unmapped wilderness. The year was 1732, and King George II sat on the British throne, ruling an empire that already spanned the globe. Virginia itself was the oldest and wealthiest of Britain's American colonies. Founded in 1607, it had spent 125 years transforming itself from a struggling outpost into a prosperous plantation society built on two crops, tobacco and human bondage. The fertile soil along the tidal rivers, the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the York and the James, produced tobacco that European markets craved. And that tobacco was cultivated, harvested and processed by enslaved Africans, whose forced labour made Virginia's gentry rich. The social structure was rigid and unforgiving. At the top stood the great planter families, the Lees, the Carters, the Fairfaxes, families who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves. They built grand plantation houses, imported fine goods from London, and dominated the colonial government. Their sons were educated in England. Their daughters married into other wealthy families. They were an aristocracy in everything but name. Below them came the middling planters, men who owned perhaps a few hundred to 1,000 acres, a dozen or 2 dozen slaves, men who worked their own land alongside their bondservants, but who aspired to the wealth and status of the great families above them. Further down the hierarchy were the small farmers, who owned perhaps 50 to 100 acres, perhaps one or two slaves or none at all, men who worked with their own hands, who would never be wealthy but hoped to provide for their families and perhaps leave their children a step higher on the ladder. And at the very bottom, making up nearly half of Virginia's population, were the enslaved Africans. Men, women, and children who were property, who could be bought and sold, who had no legal rights, who lived and died at the whim of their owners. Their labour was the foundation upon which all of Virginia's prosperity rested, and that terrible truth would haunt the colony and the nation it helped create for centuries to come. Into this world, into this system of hierarchy and bondage, George Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732. By the old Julian calendar still in use at the time, the date was recorded as February 11th, 1731. But when Britain adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752, the date shifted forward to become February 22nd, 1732, the birthday Americans would eventually celebrate. The place of his birth was Pope's Creek Plantation in Westmoreland County, Virginia, on what was called the Northern Neck, the peninsula of land between the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers. It was tobacco country, flat land dotted with plantation houses, each one the centre of a small agricultural empire worked by enslaved hands. The Washington family, George Washington's father, was Augustine Washington, a man whose position in Virginia society was respectable but not exalted. Augustine owned nearly 3,000 acres of tobacco land scattered across several plantations, including the future Mount Vernon overlooking the Potomac River. He also managed an iron furnace for an English company, dabbling in the colony's tentative industrial ventures. Augustine was doing well by Virginia standards, but he was not one of the great planters. He was a middling member of the gentry, comfortable but not wealthy, respected but not powerful. He was building something for his family, accumulating land, investing in enterprises, positioning his sons to rise higher than he had. But Augustine's life had been marked by loss. His first wife, Jane Butler Washington, had died in 1729, leaving him with 3 children, Lawrence Augustine Jr., called Austin, and Jane. A widower with young children and a plantation to run could not remain unmarried long. He needed a wife to manage his household, to raise his children, to give him more sons to carry on the Washington name. In 1731, Augustine married Mary Ball. She was the daughter of a prosperous planter, orphaned young and raised by relatives. She brought no great fortune to the marriage, but she came from good Virginia stock. She was 23 years old, strong-willed, capable, and deeply religious. By all accounts, she was a difficult woman, stern and demanding, prone to complaint and never satisfied. She would live to be 80 years old, and she would dominate her children's lives in ways both profound and troubling. George was her first child, born less than a year after the wedding. He arrived on a cold February morning at Pope's Creek, a healthy baby boy who would be the eldest of the 6 children that Mary Ball Washington would bear: George, Elizabeth, called Betty, Samuel, John Augustine, Charles, and Mildred, who died in infancy. The household into which George was born was not grand. The house at Pope's Creek was a modest wooden structure, comfortable but not elegant. The family owned slaves who worked the tobacco fields and tended the house. Young George would have been surrounded from his earliest moments by the presence of enslaved people. Black faces as familiar to him as his own family. People whose bondage he would accept without question, as simply the way the world worked. Around 1735, when George was about 3 years old, the family moved up the Potomac River to another Washington property, a plantation on Little Hunting Creek that Lawrence, George's eldest half-brother, would later rename Mount Vernon after Admiral Edward Vernon, under whom he had served in the British Navy. But the family's time at Little Hunting Creek was brief. In 1738, when George was 6, they moved again to Ferry Farm, a 280-acre plantation on the Rappahannock River directly across from the town of Fredericksburg. This would be George's childhood home, the place where he would spend his formative years. Ferry Farm was a working plantation, busy and crowded. The house sat on a bluff overlooking the river, with tobacco fields spreading out behind. Enslaved workers moved through the property, tending crops, maintaining buildings, doing the endless labour that plantation life required. The river provided both transportation and income. The ferry that gave the farm its name carried travellers and goods across the Rappahannock, collecting tolls that added to the family's income. For George, Ferry Farm meant chores and responsibilities from an early age. He learned to ride horses, to use tools, to understand the rhythms of planting and harvest. He watched his father manage slaves, negotiate with merchants, juggle the complex finances of a planter, always one bad crop away from debt. These were his classrooms, the practical education of a Virginia planter's son. But there was supposed to be another kind of education waiting for him, the kind that his older half-brothers had received. Lawrence and Austin Washington had been sent to Appleby Grammar School in England, the traditional path for sons of Virginia gentry who could afford it. An English education was the mark of a gentleman, the entry ticket to the highest levels of colonial society. George would never get that chance. The end of childhood. On April 12, 1743, Augustine Washington died. He was 49 years old. The cause of death was not recorded with precision, likely some sudden illness or perhaps a stroke, but the result was catastrophic for his family. George was 11 years old. One day he had a father, a provider, a guide to the world of men. The next day he had none. The boy who should have been preparing for an English education found himself instead preparing for a very different future. Augustine's will divided his property among his sons, as Virginia law and custom demanded. To Lawrence went the plantation on Little Hunting Creek, the future Mount Vernon. To Austin went the Pope's Creek plantation where George had been born. To George went Ferry Farm and the 280 acres surrounding it, to be held in trust until he reached legal age, with his mother Mary managing it in the meantime. 3 plantations, 3 sons, but the division was far from equal. Lawrence and Austin received established properties with mature slave workforces. George received a modest farm and a mother who would prove difficult to please and impossible to escape. The death of his father meant the end of any hope for an English education. The family simply could not afford to send George abroad. The money that might have paid for years at Appleby Grammar School was needed to keep the plantations running, to maintain the family's position, to ensure that all the children had something when they came of age. And so George's formal education, what little there was of it, came to an abrupt end. He had learned to read and write from his father, and later from a series of private tutors and perhaps a local school in Fredericksburg. He had studied basic arithmetic. He had copied moral maxims from books, learning the rules of civility and behaviour that were supposed to govern a gentleman's conduct. But he had no Latin, no Greek, no philosophy, no classical literature, none of the educational markers that defined Virginia's elite. For the rest of his life, George Washington would be acutely aware of these gaps in his education. He would surround himself with educated men, defer to their knowledge, and work tirelessly to improve himself through reading and study. But he would never fully escape the shame of being, by the standards of his class, uneducated. What he did have was something else entirely, a body built for physical labour, a practical mind that grasped numbers and measurements, and a fierce determination to rise above the modest circumstances his father's death had left him. The boy was tall for his age, strong, with large hands and feet that promised he would grow into a powerful man. He loved the outdoors, the woods and rivers of Virginia. He could ride a horse as well as any man in the colony. He could throw a stone farther than anyone else's age. These were not trivial skills in a world where physical prowess mattered, where a man's reputation often rested as much on his strength and courage as on his learning. But physical strength alone would not restore what his father's death had taken away. George needed a path forward, a way to rise, a means to distinguish himself and reclaim the status that should have been his birthright. That path would come from an unexpected source, his eldest half-brother Lawrence, who would become the most important influence in young George's life. Lawrence and the Fairfaxes. Lawrence Washington was everything the young George aspired to be. He was educated, cultured, and connected. He had served as an officer in the British military during the War of Jenkins' Ear, fighting in the Caribbean, and earning a commission that gave him the right to be called captain. He had married well, very well indeed, and that marriage would open doors for his younger half-brother that would otherwise have remained forever closed. In 1743, the same year their father died, Lawrence married Anne Fairfax. She was the daughter of William Fairfax, who was the cousin and agent of Lord Fairfax, one of the wealthiest men in Virginia and the proprietor of more than 5 million acres in the Northern Neck. Through this marriage, Lawrence Washington entered the inner circle of Virginia's most powerful family. For George, this meant access to a world he could never have entered on his own. Lawrence invited his younger brother to Mount Vernon regularly. George spent weeks and months at his half-brother's estate, away from his mother's sharp tongue and endless demands, welcomed into a house where learning and gentility were prized. At Mount Vernon, George met the Fairfaxes. He visited Belvoir, their magnificent plantation just 4 miles down the Potomac, where William Fairfax served as Lord Fairfax's agent and manager. The Fairfax household was everything Ferry Farm was not: elegant, educated, cosmopolitan. They dined on fine china with silver flatware. They spoke of European politics and classical literature. They embodied the refinement that George had been denied by his father's death, and they taught him. Not formally, not as tutors, but through example and gentle correction. George learned table manners, how to eat and drink in polite society without embarrassing himself. He learned how to dress like a gentleman, how to carry himself with dignity, how to speak with confidence even when he felt out of his depth. He also learned dancing, a crucial social skill. A man who could not dance was excluded from the balls and gatherings where Virginia's elite made matches and forged alliances. George proved surprisingly good at it, his natural athleticism translating into grace on the dance floor. The Fairfaxes also gave George his first real opportunity. In 1748, when he was 16 years old, George accompanied a surveying party into the Shenandoah Valley on behalf of Lord Fairfax. The trip was organised by George William Fairfax, William's son, and only a year older than George. Together the two young men spent a month in the wilderness, measuring land, marking boundaries, sleeping in tents or sometimes in the open air, living rough in a way that would have horrified gentlemen who had never left their plantations. For George, the experience was transformative. He kept a journal of the journey, practicing his writing and recording his observations. He learned to survey land with precision, using compass and chain to map the invisible property lines that meant wealth and power in Virginia. And he discovered that he loved it, the independence, the adventure, the sense of purpose that came from useful work. More importantly, surveying was a profession. It required skill but not extensive education. It paid well, and it provided access to something even more valuable than money: knowledge of where the best unclaimed land could be found. In Virginia, land was power, and a surveyor who knew where to look could speculate in western lands, buying cheap and selling dear as settlement pushed into the wilderness. By the time George returned from the Shenandoah Valley, He had found his calling. The College of William and Mary chartered county surveyors in Virginia, and through Lawrence's connections to the Fairfaxes, George secured an appointment as surveyor of Culpeper County in 1749. He was 17 years old, and he finally had a profession. For the next 3 years, George Washington worked as a surveyor. He travelled through the backcountry, often alone or with a small crew, mapping plantations, resolving boundary disputes, and accumulating both income and land. He lived rough, sleeping in barns or under the stars, eating whatever he could buy or shoot. It was hard, dangerous work that took him far from the comforts of civilization. But it toughened him, built his endurance, and gave him an intimate knowledge of Virginia's western lands. It also gave him money of his own, independent of his mother. By 1751, at age 19, George Washington owned nearly 1,500 acres of land in the Shenandoah Valley, purchased with his surveying fees. He was building wealth, slowly but surely. And then Lawrence fell ill. Lawrence's death and George's inheritance. Tuberculosis, called consumption in the 18th century, was one of the great killers of the age. It struck the young and the strong, wasting them away over months or years until they died in paroxysms of coughing, their lungs destroyed, their bodies reduced to shadows. Lawrence Washington had contracted tuberculosis, probably during his military service in the Caribbean. By 1751, his condition had deteriorated to the point that his doctors recommended a desperate measure: a voyage to a warmer climate in hopes that the change of air might restore his health. Lawrence decided to travel to Barbados, and he asked George to accompany him. In September 1751, the two brothers boarded a ship in Virginia and sailed for the Caribbean. It would be the only time in his entire life that George Washington left the North American continent. The voyage took 6 weeks, and the brothers arrived in Barbados in November. They rented a house, met with local society, and tried to enjoy themselves while Lawrence sought improvement in his health. None came. The tropical air did nothing to arrest the consumption. Lawrence grew weaker by the day, and then George fell ill with smallpox. The disease struck him suddenly, the fever rising, the telltale pustules erupting across his skin. Smallpox was one of the most feared diseases of the 18th century. It killed perhaps 30% of those it infected, and it left survivors scarred for life, their faces marked with the pitted craters where the pustules had been. George was lucky. He survived. The attack was relatively mild, and while it left scars on his face, they were not disfiguring, but the disease may have done something else. It may have rendered him sterile. Washington would never have biological children, and some historians have speculated that the smallpox he contracted in Barbados in 1751 destroyed his ability to father them. By December, it was clear that Lawrence was not improving. The brothers made arrangements to return to Virginia, but Lawrence was too weak to travel immediately. George sailed home in December, leaving his dying brother behind to follow when he could. Lawrence made it back to Mount Vernon in the summer of 1752, but he was dying, and he knew it. He settled his affairs, including his will, and on July 26, 1752, Lawrence Washington died at Mount Vernon. He was 34 years old. George was 20 years old, and he had lost the one person who had truly guided him, protected him, and opened doors for him in Virginia society. Lawrence had been more than a half-brother. He had been a mentor, a friend, and a surrogate father. Lawrence's will was complex. Mount Vernon went to his infant daughter Sarah, with the provision that if she died without heirs, the estate would pass to George. Lawrence's wife Anne retained a life interest in the property. George was appointed one of the executors of the estate, and eventually, when Sarah died in infancy as so many children did, and after negotiating with Lawrence's widow, George Washington inherited Mount Vernon. But in 1752, that inheritance was still years in the future. What George received immediately was something else. Lawrence's position as adjutant of the Virginia militia, a military appointment that came with the rank of major, and a salary of £100 a year. George Washington, who had never served a day in any military force, who had never commanded men or fought in battle, was now a major in the Virginia militia. It was the beginning of a military career that would define his life and change the course of history. But first, he needed to learn how to be a soldier, and the French were about to give him an education in warfare that no military academy could have provided. The mission to the Ohio. The Ohio Valley in the 1750s was a vast wilderness, a territory claimed by both Britain and France but controlled by neither. The land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River represented the future of North America, and whoever dominated it would dominate the continent. The French understood this. They had built a chain of forts from Canada down through the Great Lakes and into the Ohio country, claiming the entire region as New France. They allied with Native American tribes, established trading posts, and made clear that they had no intention of allowing British settlement west of the mountains. The British colonies, particularly Virginia, had different ideas. Virginia's charter theoretically extended its western boundary all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Virginia gentlemen, including members of the Washington family, had invested in land speculation companies that held grants for millions of acres in the Ohio Valley. If the French claims stood, those investments were worthless. In 1753, Virginia's Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie decided to act. He would send an emissary to the French forts in the Ohio country, carrying a message demanding that France abandon its claims and withdraw its forces. It was a diplomatic mission, but one freighted with the possibility of war. Dinwiddie needed someone young enough to endure the hardships of a winter journey through hundreds of miles of wilderness, someone with enough status to be taken seriously as the representative of a British colony, and someone expendable enough that his death or capture wouldn't be a catastrophe for Virginia. He chose Major George Washington, who was 21 years old and eager for any opportunity to distinguish himself. Washington departed Williamsburg in late October 1753, carrying Dinwiddie's letter to the French commandant. With him went a small party: Christopher Gist, an experienced frontiersman and guide, a French translator, and a few servants. They travelled northwest through Virginia, crossed the Allegheny Mountains, and entered the contested Ohio country. The journey was as hard as anything Washington had ever endured. The weather was brutal, cold rains turning to sleet and snow. The terrain was difficult, mountains giving way to forests so thick that the party sometimes covered only a few miles in a day. They waded through freezing rivers. They slept in the open or in rough shelters. They lived on game they could shoot and whatever meagre supplies they carried. They also met with Native American leaders, particularly the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, whose allegiance both France and Britain sought. Washington observed the diplomatic dance between the Europeans and the native peoples with the careful eye of someone who understood that these alliances would determine who controlled the continent. Finally, in early December, Washington reached Fort Le Boeuf, a French outpost near present-day Waterford, Pennsylvania. He presented Dinwiddie's letter to the French commandant, Captain Jacques Le Gardeur de Saint-Pierre. The commandant received him courteously, read the letter, and replied with polite firmness. The French had no intention of abandoning their claims to the Ohio Valley. If the British wanted it, they would have to fight for it. Washington had his answer. Now he had to get it back to Williamsburg. The return journey nearly killed him. The party started back in mid-December, in the depths of winter. The cold was savage. Ice covered the rivers, snow blocked the trails. Washington's horse gave out, forcing him to continue on foot. At one point, travelling through the forest, a Native American in their party fired a rifle at Washington from close range, missing him by inches. Whether it was an assassination attempt, an accident, or something else entirely remains unclear. Then came the most dangerous moment of the entire journey. Washington and Christopher Gist were attempting to cross the Allegheny River on a makeshift raft, when the raft broke apart in the ice-choked current. Washington was thrown into the freezing water. The cold was so intense that it should have killed him within minutes, but he managed to grab onto a log and pull himself to a small island in the middle of the river. He and Gist spent the night on the island without fire, without shelter, in temperatures well below freezing. Washington's clothes froze solid on his body. By morning, miraculously, the river had frozen enough that they could walk across the ice to the far bank. They stumbled into a frontier settlement, rested briefly, and pushed on. Washington reached Williamsburg in mid-January 1754, half frozen and exhausted, but alive and carrying the French commander's defiant response. Governor Dinwiddie immediately had Washington write up a full account of his journey. It was published as the Journal of Major George Washington and distributed not just in Virginia but in London. At 22 years old, George Washington became an international figure, the colonial officer who had travelled to the French frontier and returned with news that war was coming. But reputation and reality are different things. Washington was famous now, but he had never fought a battle, never commanded troops in combat, never faced an enemy determined to kill him. All of that was about to change, and the lessons would be harsh and humiliating. The French and Indian War was about to begin, and George Washington would fire some of its first shots. Fought necessity. In the spring of 1754, Governor Dinwiddie promoted George Washington to lieutenant colonel and gave him command of a regiment of Virginia soldiers with orders to march to the Ohio country and defend British interests. Washington was 22 years old, leading men into potential combat for the first time in his life. The force Washington commanded was small, fewer than 200 men, poorly trained, badly equipped, and lacking in supplies. They were not professional soldiers, but militia, farmers and labourers who had volunteered or been pressed into service. Many had never fired a gun in anger. Their officers, like Washington himself, were learning as they went. They marched northwest in April 1754, heading toward the forks of the Ohio River, where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers met. This strategic location, the future site of Pittsburgh, was the key to controlling the Ohio Valley. Dinwiddie had ordered a fort to be built there, but when Washington's force arrived in the area, they learned that the French had already seized the position, driven out the small Virginia garrison, and constructed their own Fort Duquesne. Washington had come to defend a fort that no longer existed. Uncertain what to do, he continued forward cautiously, establishing a base camp and sending out scouts to track French movements. In late May, one of his Native American allies, a Seneca chief named Tanacharison, called the Half-King by the English, brought news. A French scouting party was camped nearby. Washington made a decision that would have momentous consequences. He would attack. On the morning of May 28, 1754, Washington led a party of 40 Virginia soldiers and a dozen Native American warriors to the French camp. What happened next is disputed. The French claimed they were on a diplomatic mission and were attacked without warning. The British claimed the French opened fire first. What is certain is that in the brief chaotic skirmish that followed, 10 Frenchmen were killed, including the commander, Ensign Joseph Coulon de Villiers, Sieur de Jumonville. Tanacharison, the Half-King, reportedly killed Jumonville personally, splitting his skull with a tomahawk as the wounded Frenchman lay on the ground. It was a political statement. The Native Americans were choosing sides, and they had chosen the British, or so it seemed at the time. Washington's small victory had enormous consequences. The French called it an assassination. The British called it self-defense. But both empires now had a pretext for war. The 7 Years' War, which would eventually engulf Europe, Asia and the Americas, had begun with a skirmish led by a 22-year-old Virginia colonel who'd been trying to prove himself. The French response was swift. A much larger force, perhaps 600 men, was dispatched from Fort Duquesne to find Washington and punish him for the attack. Washington, realizing he was vastly outnumbered, ordered his men to construct a fortification. They chose a meadow called Great Meadows and built a small circular palisade that Washington optimistically named Fort Necessity. It was a terrible position. The fort sat in a low, marshy area surrounded by wooded hills. Any enemy with rifles could fire down into the fort from the tree line. The ground inside the palisade turned to mud at the first rain. There was no source of fresh water within the walls. On July 3rd, 1754, the French force arrived. They did not attack directly. They simply took up positions in the woods around the fort and began shooting. Washington's men, trapped in the muddy enclosure, tried to return fire, but they were shooting blind at an enemy they could barely see. It rained all day. The Virginia soldiers stood in water up to their ankles, their gunpowder getting wet, their muskets misfiring. Casualties mounted. Men fell from bullet wounds, crying out in pain, bleeding into the mud. By evening, Washington's position was hopeless. He had lost a quarter of his force. His ammunition was nearly exhausted. He had no supplies, no reinforcements, and no prospect of relief. When the French commander offered terms of surrender, Washington accepted. The surrender document was in French, which Washington could not read fluently. His translator, a man who had been drinking heavily to steady his nerves, provided a rough translation. Washington signed, believing he was acknowledging a military defeat. What the document actually said was that Washington admitted to the assassination of Jumonville. The French had tricked him into confessing to murder. The next morning, July 4th, 1754, George Washington marched his defeated army out of Fort Necessity and began the long, humiliating journey back to Virginia. His first military campaign had ended in complete and total failure. He resigned his commission shortly after reaching Williamsburg. At 22 years old, his military career appeared to be over before it had truly begun. He had been defeated, humiliated, tricked into signing a false confession. Every gentleman in Virginia knew what had happened. The promising young officer was now the officer who had surrendered, but the war Washington had helped start was far from over, and within a year he would be given a second chance to prove himself, riding alongside one of Britain's most respected generals into an ambush that would teach him lessons he would never forget. Braddock's defeat. In 1755, the British Empire decided to take the French and Indian War seriously. King George II dispatched 2 regiments of regular British troops to North America under the command of Major General Edward Braddock, a career officer with 45 years of military experience. Braddock's mission was clear: drive the French from the Ohio Valley, starting with the capture of Fort Duquesne. George Washington, despite his failure at Fort Necessity, was invited to join Braddock's expedition as a volunteer aide-de-camp. It was a remarkable opportunity. Washington would serve on the general's personal staff, learning from a professional soldier, observing regular British troops in action, and perhaps redeeming his tarnished reputation. Washington accepted immediately. He rode north to join Braddock's army as it assembled in Maryland. The force that marched into the wilderness in June 1755 was the most formidable military expedition ever mounted in North America. 400 British regulars and 450 colonial troops, with artillery, wagons, and all the apparatus of 18th century European warfare. They cut a road through the forest as they advanced, 12 feet wide, suitable for cannon and supply wagons. But the army moved with agonizing slowness. The heavily loaded wagons bogged down in mud. The road had to be cleared of trees and rocks. Soldiers not accustomed to wilderness conditions suffered in the heat and struggled with the terrain. What should have been a week's march turned into a month-long ordeal. Washington, assigned to help coordinate the colonial troops and scouts, watched the British regulars with a mixture of admiration and concern. They were professional in every sense, disciplined and well-trained, but they were preparing to fight a European war in the American wilderness. Their tactics assumed open battlefields, clear lines of sight, massed formations firing in volleys. Washington had seen how the French and their Native American allies actually fought, from cover, using trees and terrain, striking and disappearing. He tried to suggest that the army prepare for irregular warfare. Braddock dismissed him politely. The British Army did not take tactical advice from 23-year-old colonial volunteers. As the army approached Fort Duquesne in early July, Washington fell ill with a violent fever, probably dysentery. He was so sick that he had to be left behind with the baggage train, lying in a wagon, too weak to ride. He begged to be allowed to rejoin the army before the attack, but his condition was too poor. On July 9th, 1755, Braddock's advance force crossed the Monongahela River about 8 miles from Fort Duquesne. The crossing went smoothly. The forest seemed quiet. The regulars marched in formation, colours flying, drums beating, confident in their training and their firepower. They walked into hell. A combined force of French soldiers and Native American warriors, perhaps 250 men total, attacked from the woods on both sides of the road. They did not form lines or charge in the open. They fired from behind trees from cover, moving and shooting, impossible to see, impossible to target. The British regulars tried to respond as they had been trained. They formed firing lines, stood shoulder to shoulder, and fired volleys into the forest. But they were shooting at shadows. The enemy was invisible, and the bullets coming from the trees were finding their marks with terrible efficiency. The British officers made easy targets. Mounted on horses, wearing bright uniforms, shouting orders, they were picked off one by one. Within the first few minutes of combat, most of Braddock's senior officers were killed or wounded. The soldiers began to panic. They broke formation, ran for cover, fired wildly into the trees. Colonial soldiers who had fought Native Americans before tried to take cover and return fire from behind trees, but the British regulars, trained to despise such cowardly behaviour, shot at them, thinking they were deserters. Braddock himself rode back and forth, trying to rally his men, refusing to take cover, cursing at soldiers who hid behind trees, ordering them to stand in formation and fight like men. He was shot from his horse, the bullet passing through his arm and into his lung. Meanwhile, back with the baggage train, George Washington heard the gunfire. Despite his illness, despite being so weak he could barely sit upright, he mounted his horse and rode toward the battle. He arrived to find chaos, British regulars and colonial soldiers running in every direction, wounded men screaming, the forest alive with gunfire from an enemy no one could see. Washington spent the afternoon riding through the killing zone, delivering orders, trying to organize some kind of defensive line, helping to rally small groups of men who might otherwise have fled entirely. 2 horses were shot out from under him. Bullets tore through his coat and hat. He later counted 4 bullet holes in his clothing, but somehow he was not hit. It was carnage on an almost incomprehensible scale. Out of the 100 men in Braddock's force, 977 were killed or wounded. 63 of the 86 officers were casualties. The army that had marched so confidently into the forest was destroyed in less than 3 hours. The survivors fled, abandoning their wounded, their artillery, their supplies, everything. They ran in terror back toward the river crossing, and they kept running. Braddock, mortally wounded, was carried from the field. He died 4 days later, portedly murmuring, "We shall better know how to deal with them another time." He was buried in the middle of the road his army had cut, and wagons were driven over the grave to hide its location from native warriors who would have mutilated the corpse. George Washington, still weak from illness, helped organize the retreat. He had fought for hours, rallied men, shown physical courage that impressed even the British regulars who had dismissed colonial soldiers as rabble. Word of his conduct spread quickly. He had been the only senior officer on the field who had not been killed or incapacitated. He had kept his head while all around him men had panicked. The battle had been a disaster, but Washington's personal reputation was transformed. He went from failed colonial officer to military hero in a single afternoon of blood and chaos. He returned to Virginia to find that Governor Dinwiddie had appointed him colonel and given him command of all Virginia forces. At 23 years old, George Washington was responsible for defending Virginia's frontier against French and Native American raids. It was an impossible job, but he threw himself into it with all his considerable energy. For the next 3 years, Washington commanded Virginia's frontier defences. He learned to manage men, to deal with politicians, to stretch inadequate resources as far as they could go. He fought no major battles, but he kept Virginia's borders defended through a combination of determination and sheer force of will. And then, in 1758, everything changed again. A new British general, John Forbes, mounted another expedition against Fort Duquesne, this time with better preparation and better tactics. Washington accompanied the expedition as commander of the Virginia troops. When they reached Fort Duquesne in November 1758, they found it abandoned. The French, unable to defend it against a superior force, had burned the fort and retreated. The Ohio Valley was won, not through Washington's direct action, but he had been there at the end, part of the victory. His military reputation was secure. At 26 years old, he decided it was time to retire from military service and pursue a different kind of life. He resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon, which he had inherited after Lawrence's daughter, and then Lawrence's widow had died. He was now a plantation owner, a Virginia gentleman with land and prospects. It was time to marry. Martha Custis. Martha Dandridge Custis was 27 years old when she met George Washington in the spring of 1758. She was one of the wealthiest women in Virginia and one of the most pursued. Her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, had died the previous year, leaving her with 2 small children, enormous wealth, and complete control of her own fortune. Under Virginia law, a widow retained ownership of her property until she remarried. Martha owned nearly 18,000 acres of prime Virginia land, 300 enslaved people, and a fortune in cash and investments. She was not just wealthy, she was powerful. She was also petite, barely 5 feet tall, with dark hair and dark eyes, a ready laugh and a warm manner. She was practical, intelligent, and had managed her first husband's vast estates competently. She knew her own worth, both financial and personal, and she had no need to marry for money or security. George Washington, on the other hand, needed exactly what Martha could provide: wealth, social position, and the resources to transform Mount Vernon from a modest plantation into one of the great estates of Virginia. It was in every practical sense a perfect match. But something else happened between them. Something that transcended the calculations of money and advantage. They fell in love. Or if not the romantic passion of poetry, then something deeper and more lasting. A genuine partnership, mutual respect, and a companionship that would sustain both of them through the trials that lay ahead. They married on January 6, 1759, at Martha's estate, the White House plantation on the Pamunkey River. She wore a gown of yellow silk. He wore his Virginia militia uniform. The ceremony was private, attended by family and a few close friends. Afterward, they moved to Mount Vernon with Martha's 2 children, 4-year-old John Parke Custis, called Jackie, and 2-year-old Martha Parke Custis, called Patsy. Washington would have no biological children of his own, likely because of the smallpox he had contracted years before in Barbados. But he became a devoted stepfather to Jackie and Patsy, treating them with affection and taking responsibility for their education and well-being. The marriage brought Washington wealth beyond anything he could have accumulated on his own. Martha's dower share of the Custis estate effectively tripled his land holdings. He now owned or controlled more than 11,000 acres. He had cash to invest in improving Mount Vernon, buying more land, and positioning himself among Virginia's genuine elite. And so began what Washington himself would later describe as the happiest period of his life. From 1759 to 775, 16 years, he lived the life of a Virginia gentleman planter. He expanded Mount Vernon, adding rooms, improving the grounds, transforming it into a showplace. He experimented with different crops, trying to move away from dependence on tobacco toward more diverse agriculture. He served in the Virginia House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature, gaining experience in politics and governance. He hunted foxes with his neighbours. He attended balls and dinners. He welcomed a steady stream of visitors to Mount Vernon, feeding them, entertaining them, corresponding with them afterward. He supervised the labour of the people he enslaved, buying more, selling some, and generally treating them as the valuable property that Virginia law said they were. On the surface, it was an idyllic existence, a beautiful estate, a loving wife, stepchildren, social prominence, and increasing wealth. Washington seemed to have everything a Virginia gentleman could want, but across the Atlantic events were unfolding that would pull him away from this comfortable life and set him on a path he could never have imagined. The British Empire, victorious in the 7 Years' War, now faced crushing debts. Parliament needed revenue, and they looked to the American colonies to help pay for their own defence. The taxes that followed, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, would transform George Washington from a contented planter into a revolutionary, and the revolution would transform him from a man who owned slaves and served the king into the father of a new nation, founded on principles he had never quite lived up to, but which would outlast him by centuries. The road to rebellion. The trouble began with taxes, not extraordinary taxes, not confiscatory rates, but the simple assertion by Parliament that it had the right to tax the American colonies without their consent. The Stamp Act of 1765 required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, and other printed materials. The revenue would help pay for British troops stationed in America. To Parliament, it seemed reasonable. To many colonists, it was tyranny. George Washington, sitting in the Virginia House of Burgesses, watched the crisis unfold with growing concern. He had been a loyal British subject his entire life. He had fought for the king in the French and Indian War. He had never questioned British authority. But the Stamp Act violated a principle Washington held sacred, the right of property. If Parliament could tax the colonies without their consent, then colonists had no real property rights. Everything they owned existed only at the pleasure of a distant government, in which they had no representation. Washington joined his fellow Virginia Burgesses in protesting the Stamp Act. The protest worked. Parliament repealed the tax in 1766, but the underlying issue remained unresolved. Did Parliament have the right to tax the colonies or not? The Townshend Acts of 1767 answered that question. Parliament would tax the colonies. New duties were imposed on glass, lead, paint, paper and tea imported into America. The revenue would pay the salaries of royal governors and judges, making them independent of colonial legislatures. Again, Virginia protested. Again, Washington signed non-importation agreements, pledging to boycott British goods until the taxes were repealed. He was not yet a radical, not yet calling for independence, but he was moving in that direction, pushed by each new assertion of parliamentary power. The crisis escalated in 1773 with the Tea Act, which granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America. The colonists responded with the Boston Tea Party, dumping 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbour. Parliament's response was swift and harsh. The Coercive Acts, which colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston's port, revoked Massachusetts's charter, and placed the colony under military rule. British troops occupied Boston. General Thomas Gage, the military governor, made clear that resistance would be crushed. The other colonies watched in alarm. If Parliament could destroy Massachusetts's liberties, no colony was safe. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress to coordinate a response. Virginia sent a strong delegation that included George Washington. At 42 years old, tall, imposing, wealthy, and with a reputation for military service, Washington was chosen as one of Virginia's 7 representatives. He travelled to Philadelphia and took his seat among the most important men in America. The Congress debated for weeks. Some delegates wanted reconciliation with Britain. Others advocated resistance. Washington said little, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. He opposed British policies, but he was not yet ready for open rebellion. The Congress agreed on a continental association, a complete boycott of British goods. If Britain did not repeal the Intolerable Acts, the colonies would stop all trade with the mother country. It was economic warfare, a step short of military conflict but unmistakably hostile. Washington returned to Virginia and began preparing for war. He drilled the county militia. He studied military texts. He put Mount Vernon's affairs in order, as if anticipating a long absence. Martha watched her husband prepare and understood what was coming. In April 1775, the waiting ended. British troops marched from Boston to seize colonial military supplies at Concord, Massachusetts. On Lexington Green, they encountered armed militia. Someone fired a shot. The British volley killed 8 colonists. The war had begun. News of Lexington and Concord reached Virginia in late April. The Second Continental Congress was scheduled to meet in May in Philadelphia, and this time they would not be debating trade policy. They would be organizing a war. George Washington packed his military uniform, the same Virginia militia uniform he had worn fighting the French 2 decades earlier, and rode north to Philadelphia. He was about to be offered a position he had never sought, commanding an army in a war that most military experts believed he could not possibly win. Commander-in-Chief. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on May 10, 1775. The delegates faced an impossible situation. British troops occupied Boston. Colonial militia surrounded the city, but they had no unified command, no organization, no supply system. They were an armed mob, not an army. Congress needed to create an army and appoint a commander. The political calculation was delicate. Most of the troops besieging Boston were from New England. A New England general would make military sense but would alienate the southern colonies whose support was essential. John Adams of Massachusetts understood the problem. On June 14, 1775, he rose in Congress and nominated George Washington of Virginia to command the Continental forces. It was a brilliant political stroke. Washington was from the South. He had military experience. His personal wealth demonstrated he could not be bought. and his presence in Philadelphia, wearing his militia uniform to every session, reminded delegates that he was ready to serve. Washington was in the room when Adams made the nomination. According to witnesses, he immediately fled into an adjoining chamber, embarrassed by the attention. He genuinely did not want the position. He doubted his own abilities. He knew the challenge was enormous, possibly fatal. But duty called. When Congress unanimously elected him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army on June 15, 1775, Washington accepted. His brief acceptance speech was characteristic. Humble, honest about his limitations, and absolutely committed to the cause. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honoured with," he told Congress. He declined any salary, asking only that his expenses be covered, and he made a promise: "I will not desert the cause." He wrote to Martha that night, trying to explain why he had accepted a position that would take him away from her, from Mount Vernon, from the life they had built together. "It has been determined in Congress that the whole army raised for the defense of the American cause shall be put under my care," he wrote. "I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid it." But he could not avoid it. On June 21, 1775, George Washington left Philadelphia and rode north toward Boston to take command of an army he had never seen, to fight a war no one knew how to win. The siege of Boston, Washington, reached the outskirts of Boston on July 2, 1775, and what he found was not an army but a collection of armed men. Some 14,000 troops surrounded the city in camps that ranged from organized to chaotic. They had few uniforms, little discipline, and almost no military training. Officers were elected by their men and often could not maintain order. Soldiers came and went as they pleased. They refused orders they disagreed with. Washington was appalled. These were not soldiers. They were farmers playing at war, and they were facing 6,000 British regulars, professional troops with discipline, training, and the weight of the world's most powerful military empire behind them. He set to work transforming the mob into an army. He established a clear chain of command. He imposed strict discipline, ordering officers flogged for leaving their posts, soldiers punished for desertion or cowardice. He drilled the troops relentlessly, teaching them to march in formation, to fire in volleys, to obey orders immediately. He also discovered that he had almost no gunpowder. The army besieging Boston had enough ammunition for perhaps 9 shots per man. If the British attacked in force, the Continental Army would be destroyed in an afternoon. Washington concealed this terrifying shortage from his own troops, from Congress, and most critically from the British. He maintained an aggressive posture, building fortifications, positioning artillery, acting as if he could fight at any moment. It was an enormous bluff, and somehow it worked. Meanwhile, Washington struggled with problems that had nothing to do with military tactics. His troops were enlisted for short terms, usually until the end of the year. As 1775 turned to 1776, entire regiments simply went home. Their enlistments expired. Washington had to rebuild his army while maintaining the siege, recruiting new soldiers to replace those who left. Congress provided almost no support. They had no money to pay the troops, no system for supplying them with food or clothing, no mechanisms for managing an army. Washington spent his own money to keep his staff fed. He begged, borrowed, and improvised to keep his forces in the field. The breakthrough came in early 1776 when Colonel Henry Knox arrived with artillery captured from Fort Ticonderoga in New York. Knox had dragged cannons weighing thousands of pounds over 300 miles of winter wilderness, an almost impossible feat of logistics. Washington now had heavy guns. On the night of March 4th, 1776, Washington ordered those guns placed on Dorchester Heights, the high ground overlooking Boston from the south. It was a massive operation, moving artillery up the slopes in darkness, positioning them before dawn. When the British awoke on March 5th and saw cannons aimed down at their ships and fortifications, they understood their position was untenable. Washington could shell the city into rubble. British General William Howe made a quick decision: evacuate. On March 17, 1776, British forces and more than 1,000 Loyalist colonists boarded ships and sailed away, abandoning Boston to the Continental Army. Washington had won his first great victory without firing a shot, but the British were not giving up. They were simply moving. Their next target was obvious: New York City, the strategic heart of the colonies, the port that controlled access to the Hudson River and the interior. If the British held New York, they could cut the colonies in half. Washington marched his army south, knowing that the next battle would not be won so easily. And he was right. The campaign for New York would be a disaster that would nearly destroy both the Continental Army and George Washington's reputation as a commander. Disaster. In New York, in July 1776, as the Continental Congress declared independence in Philadelphia, George Washington watched the largest military force ever assembled in North America sail into New York Harbor. General William Howe had returned with an army of 32,000 British and Hessian troops, supported by a fleet of more than 400 ships. It was an overwhelming display of imperial power, and it was aimed at a single objective: crush the rebellion by seizing New York and destroying Washington's army. Washington had about 19,000 men, mostly untrained, poorly equipped, and increasingly demoralized. He tried to defend Manhattan, Long Island, and the surrounding areas simultaneously, a strategic impossibility that split his forces and left them vulnerable. On August 27, 1776, Howe attacked the American positions on Long Island. It was a masterpiece of British tactics. While American forces expected a frontal assault, Howe sent the bulk of his army on a long night march through unguarded territory, outflanking Washington's entire defensive line. When the British attack came at dawn, it came from behind. American troops found themselves surrounded, caught between Howe's main force and the East River. It should have been the end of the Revolution, but Washington managed to organize a desperate nighttime evacuation, ferrying 9,000 troops across the East River to Manhattan in small boats, while a fog concealed their movement from British warships. It was a brilliant tactical retreat, but it was still a retreat. The Battle of Long Island was a crushing American defeat. Washington tried to defend Manhattan, but the British landed troops north of his positions, threatening to cut off his retreat. He abandoned the city in mid-September, pulling back to Harlem Heights, then to White Plains, each move a reluctant acknowledgement that he could not hold ground against Howe's superior force. The disasters mounted. Fort Washington, the last American stronghold on Manhattan, fell in November with nearly 3,000 prisoners taken. Fort Lee, across the Hudson River in New Jersey, was abandoned in such haste that tents, supplies, and artillery were left behind. By early December 1776, Washington's army was in full retreat across New Jersey, fleeing toward the Delaware River with British forces in pursuit. His army was disintegrating, men deserted by the hundreds, enlistments were expiring, the weather was brutal, and many soldiers lacked shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Thomas Paine, travelling with the army, wrote by campfire light, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Washington crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania on December 7th with fewer than 3,000 effective troops. The British occupied all of New Jersey. Philadelphia, the rebel capital, was within easy reach. The Continental Congress fled to Baltimore. The revolution seemed finished, but George Washington, facing the darkest moment of his life, made a decision that would transform defeat into legend. The crossing Christmas 1766 was bitterly cold. Ice choked the Delaware River. Snow fell steadily. The Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey settled in for the holiday, confident that no one would be crazy enough to attack in such weather. They were wrong. Washington had been planning the operation for weeks, gathering every boat he could find along a 70-mile stretch of the Delaware, positioning his scattered forces for a coordinated assault. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. Cross the ice-filled river at night, march 9 miles to Trenton, and attack at dawn. 3 separate crossing points were chosen. Washington would lead the main force of 2,400 men across at McConkey's Ferry. 2 smaller forces would cross downstream to cut off Hessian retreat routes. The operation began at dusk on Christmas Day. Soldiers loaded into Durham boats, large cargo vessels that could carry dozens of men and artillery. The river crossing that Washington had hoped would take 4 hours took 9. Ice battered the boats. Men struggled to maintain their footing on ice-slicked decks. 2 soldiers froze to death during the crossing. The other 2 forces never made it across. The ice was too thick, the conditions too brutal. Washington's column was alone. When the last troops reached the New Jersey shore, it was nearly 4 a.m. They were hours behind schedule. Dawn would come before they reached Trenton. Washington could have called off the attack. Instead, he ordered the march to continue. The column moved through the pre-dawn darkness in 2 divisions. Snow turned to sleet. The storm grew worse, but it provided cover, muffling sound, reducing visibility. The Hessians, warm in their quarters, heard nothing. At 8 a.m. on December 26th, Washington's troops struck Trenton from 2 directions simultaneously. The surprise was complete. Hessian soldiers stumbled from their barracks into a storm of musket fire and artillery. They tried to form defensive lines, but the Americans were already in the streets, fighting house to house. The Hessian commander, Colonel Johann Rau, was mortally wounded trying to rally his men. Within 90 minutes the battle was over. Nearly 900 Hessian soldiers surrendered. American casualties were minimal. 4 wounded, none killed in combat, though several men died from exposure during the march. Washington had achieved what military experts would have said was impossible. With an exhausted, half-frozen army, he had crossed an ice-choked river in a blizzard and won a complete victory against professional troops. But he wasn't finished. A week later, on January 2nd, 1777, with British forces converging on his position at Trenton, Washington pulled off another masterpiece of deception. He left his campfires burning, slipped away in darkness, and attacked the British rearguard at Princeton the next morning, winning another victory before disappearing into the New Jersey highlands. Trenton and Princeton changed everything. They proved the Continental Army could win battles. They restored American morale at the moment it was lowest. They demonstrated that Washington was not just a competent administrator, but a daring tactical commander willing to take enormous risks. Most importantly, they kept the revolution alive. Without Trenton, the war would likely have collapsed in the winter of 1776 to 1777. With it, the cause survived to fight another year. But the war was far from over. 6 more brutal years lay ahead, years of privation, defeat, and suffering that would test Washington's endurance and his army's loyalty to the breaking point. Valley Forge. The winter of 1777-1778 at Valley Forge has become mythic in American memory, and the myths are not far from the truth. Washington's army, about 12,000 men, went into winter quarters in December 1777 on a plateau near Philadelphia. They would stay there until June, and the suffering would be almost beyond description. The soldiers arrived exhausted from a campaign that had included defeats at Brandywine and Germantown. Philadelphia had fallen to the British. The Continental Congress had fled again. The army had neither adequate food nor shelter. The men built log huts, 12 feet by 14 feet, housing 12 soldiers each. The construction took weeks, during which soldiers slept in tents in sub-zero weather. Once completed, the huts were cramped, smoky from cooking fires, infested with lice, and barely warmer than the outside air. Food was scarce to the point of starvation. The army supply system had collapsed. Local farmers preferred to sell their produce to the British in Philadelphia, who paid in gold rather than to the Continental Army, whose paper currency was nearly worthless. Days would pass when soldiers had nothing to eat but fire cake, a mixture of flour and water baked over open flames. Washington's general orders from February 1778 tell the story. For some days past, there has been little less than a famine in camp. A part of the army has been a week without any kind of flesh, and the rest 3 or 4 days. Clothing was equally dire. Thousands of men had no shoes. They wrapped their feet in rags that quickly wore through, leaving bloody tracks in the snow. Soldiers stood guard duty naked from the waist down because they had no pants. The army had no blankets, no coats, many men sharing a single tattered garment. Disease was worse than the British. Typhoid, typhus, dysentery and pneumonia swept through the crowded huts. The hospitals, such as they were, became death houses where the sick were simply warehoused until they died. Perhaps 2,000 men perished at Valley Forge, killed not by enemy action but by exposure, starvation and disease. Yet the army did not dissolve. Men stayed, endured, suffered together. Washington shared their privations, refusing comfortable quarters, eating the same meagre rations, making himself visible every day, riding through the camp, checking on his soldiers, demonstrating that he would not abandon them. He also fought a different war, a political battle with Congress and with his critics in the army. Some officers, frustrated by defeats and privations, whispered that Washington should be replaced. General Horatio Gates, who had won the victory at Saratoga, was suggested as a better alternative. The so-called Conway Cabal, a loose conspiracy of officers and congressmen, worked to undermine Washington's authority. Washington confronted the conspiracy directly, defended his decisions, and ultimately outlasted his critics. By spring 1778, Gates's reputation had collapsed. The conspirators had scattered, and Washington's position as commander-in-chief was more secure than ever. Meanwhile, something remarkable was happening at Valley Forge. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a Prussian military officer who volunteered his services to the Continental Army, was transforming Washington's troops into professional soldiers. Von Steuben spoke almost no English, but through translators and personal demonstration, he drilled the army in European military tactics. He taught them to march in formation, to maneuver as units, to load and fire muskets with precision. He standardized drill procedures across the entire army. He turned farmers and shopkeepers into soldiers who could stand against British regulars. When the army marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778, they were no longer the desperate, half-trained force that had arrived 6 months earlier. They were a disciplined military force, hardened by suffering, trained by von Steuben, and devoted to the general who had refused to abandon them. The Battle of Monmouth in late June 1778 proved the transformation. The Continental Army fought the British to a standstill in brutal heat, nearly winning a major engagement before the British withdrew under cover of darkness. It was not a complete victory, but it demonstrated that the Americans could now fight toe-to-toe with the best troops the British Empire could field. The war would continue for 3 more years, but after Valley Forge and Monmouth, there was a new reality. The Continental Army was a permanent force, capable of sustained operations, and George Washington was firmly established as its indispensable leader. The Long War from 1778 to 1781, the Revolutionary War, became a grinding stalemate. The British held New York and other coastal cities. Washington's army lacked the strength to dislodge them. The British could not destroy Washington's army, which retreated whenever threatened and avoided decisive battle when the odds were against them. Washington's strategy was survival. Keep the army in being. Avoid catastrophic defeat. Wait for the British to make a mistake or for the French alliance, formalised in 1778, to provide the resources needed for victory. It was frustrating, tedious work. Washington spent more time managing logistics, begging Congress for supplies, and dealing with mutinies among unpaid, unfed soldiers than he did fighting battles. Years passed in camps around New York, watching the British, skirmishing occasionally, but mostly just enduring. The darkest moment came in 1780 when Benedict Arnold, one of Washington's most talented generals, betrayed the cause and defected to the British. Arnold had been plotting to surrender West Point, the crucial American fortress on the Hudson River, in exchange for British gold. The plot was discovered just in time, but Arnold escaped to British lines. The betrayal was personal for Washington. He had trusted Arnold, defended him, promoted him. To discover that one of his closest military associates was a traitor shook him to his core. He never spoke Arnold's name again. But even as Arnold fled, events were moving toward a conclusion that would vindicate Washington's long strategy of patient endurance. In 1781, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed for the Chesapeake Bay. A French army under General Rochambeau marched south from Rhode Island to join Washington. And British General Charles Cornwallis, after campaigning through the Carolinas, moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, a small tobacco port on the York River, where he waited for the British Navy to evacuate or reinforce him. Washington saw his opportunity. If the French Navy could control the Chesapeake Bay, if the American and French armies could move quickly enough, Cornwallis could be trapped. It was the decisive battle Washington had been waiting for. 8 years of war finally coming to a point. Yorktown. In late August 1781, Washington made the largest and riskiest movement of the entire war. He marched his army south from New York, a distance of nearly 450 miles, racing to reach Virginia before the British realized his intentions or before the French fleet departed. It was a remarkable feat of logistics. More than 7,000 troops moved through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland in less than a month. Washington coordinated with the French forces under Rochambeau, timed his movements to coincide with Admiral de Grasse's naval operations, and managed to keep British General Clinton in New York confused about American intentions until it was too late. Washington reached Williamsburg, Virginia, on September 14, 1781. From there, it was a short march to Yorktown, where Cornwallis waited with about 8,000 British troops. The siege began in late September. Washington's combined American and French force of more than 17,000 men surrounded Yorktown by land. The French fleet blocked escape by sea. Cornwallis was trapped. The siege followed the formal patterns of 18th century warfare. Engineers dug approach trenches, moving closer to the British fortifications. Artillery was brought forward, heavy siege guns that pounded the British positions day and night. Slowly, methodically, the noose tightened. On October 14th, American and French forces assaulted 2 key British redoubts in a night attack. Washington personally gave the order to begin the assault. Alexander Hamilton, serving as Washington's aide-de-camp, led one of the attacking columns and captured his objective in minutes. The French captured theirs with equal speed. The British position was now hopeless. Cornwallis tried to evacuate his troops across the York River on the night of October 16th, but a storm scattered the boats. On the morning of October 17th, a British drummer appeared on the ramparts, beating the signal for parley. The negotiations took 2 days. On October 19th, 1781, the British army marched out of Yorktown with flags furled, having been denied the honour of marching with colours flying. They surrendered their weapons in a formal ceremony, while a British band played The World Turned Upside Down. George Washington stood with Rochambeau and other officers, watching the British capitulation. He had waited 8 years for this moment, 8 years of defeat and privation, of soldiers dying of starvation and disease, of begging Congress for support that never came, of enduring criticism and conspiracy. 8 years, and he had never quit. He had never given up. He had believed against all evidence and reason that victory was possible if he could just hold on long enough, and he had been right. The war would officially continue for 2 more years until the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, but Yorktown was the end of serious fighting. Britain had lost the will to continue the war. American independence was won. Washington kept the Continental Army in existence until a formal peace treaty was signed, but his thoughts were already turning toward home, toward Martha, toward Mount Vernon, and the life he had left behind nearly 7 years earlier. But before he could return to private life, he would have to do something that shocked the world and established a precedent that would echo through the centuries. He would have to give up power. The surrender of power. In the spring of 1783, the Continental Army gathered at Newburgh, New York, waiting for news of a final peace treaty and wondering what would happen next. The soldiers had not been paid in months, in some cases years. Congress had promised them pensions that now seemed unlikely to materialize. They were angry, desperate, and armed. A group of officers began circulating anonymous letters calling for the army to march on Congress and take by force what had been promised to them. It was mutiny in everything but name, a military coup against the civilian government that the army had fought 8 years to establish. Washington called a meeting of his officers on March 15, 1783. He entered the hall to find his subordinates tense, angry, some already committed to the idea of using military force to secure their rights. Washington had prepared a speech urging them to remain loyal to Congress, to trust that their grievances would be addressed through proper channels. He read his speech, but the officers remained unmoved. Washington could see that his words were not reaching them, that anger and desperation had closed their minds to appeals to duty and honour. Then he did something unexpected. He pulled from his pocket a letter from a congressman discussing the army's financial situation. He began to read it, then stopped, fumbling in his coat for something. He produced a pair of reading glasses that few of his officers had ever seen him wear. "Gentlemen," Washington said, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown grey but almost blind in the service of my country." The officers, hardened by years of war, many of whom had watched friends die, began to weep. In that simple gesture, Washington reminded them of what they had sacrificed together, of the years they had endured, of the cause they had fought for. The mood in the hall shifted. The conspiracy collapsed. The army remained loyal. It was one of Washington's finest moments. Not a military victory, but a moral one. He had prevented a military takeover of the government through nothing more than personal authority and a simple acknowledgement of shared sacrifice. But the greater test was still to come. The Treaty of Paris was signed in September 1783, formally ending the war. The question now was what George Washington would do with the power he held. He commanded an army that was devoted to him personally. He was the most famous man in America, perhaps in the world. His officers had already offered to make him king. He could have seized power, established a military dictatorship, made himself the ruler of the new nation. every precedent of history suggested that victorious generals became tyrants. Washington had read his Plutarch. He knew how these stories ended. Instead, on December 4th, 1783, Washington met with his officers for the last time at Fraunces Tavern in New York. He raised a glass and said, "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honourable." Then he went around the room and embraced each officer individually, many of them weeping openly. When he was done, Washington walked out of the tavern, boarded a boat, and began his journey home. But he had one more stop to make. On December 23rd, 1783, George Washington appeared before the Continental Congress, meeting in Annapolis, Maryland. The chamber was packed. Everyone knew what was about to happen, yet no one quite believed it. Washington rose and addressed the Congress. His hands were shaking so badly that the paper he held rattled audibly. "The great events on which my resignation depended having at length taken place," he said, "I have now the honour of offering my sincere congratulations to Congress and of presenting myself before them to surrender into their hands the trust committed to me and to claim the indulgence of retiring from the service of my country." He pulled his military commission from his pocket and placed it on the table before the President of Congress. He was resigning. He was giving up command of the army. He was returning power to the civilian government. The spectacle astonished the world. King George III, when told that Washington intended to resign his commission and return to his farm, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington did exactly that. On Christmas Eve 1783 he arrived at Mount Vernon, where Martha was waiting. He had left 8 years earlier as a Virginia planter reluctantly accepting military command. He returned as the most famous man alive, voluntarily surrendering absolute power to go home. No victor in all of history had done such a thing. It would become the defining act of Washington's life, the precedent that would shape American governance for centuries. Power was something you held in trust, not something you grasped forever. When your duty was done, you went home. Washington believed he was done with public service. He was wrong. The Constitutional Convention, for 4 years from 1783 to 1787, George Washington lived the life he had always wanted. He managed Mount Vernon, experimented with crop rotation and new agricultural techniques, entertained a constant stream of visitors who made pilgrimages to meet the great general, and tried to restore the plantation's finances after years of neglect. But he could not escape the crisis facing the new nation. The Articles of Confederation, the document that governed the United States, was failing. Congress had no power to raise taxes, no authority to regulate trade between states, no ability to enforce its own decisions. The individual states acted like independent countries, often at odds with each other. Economic chaos and political instability threatened to undo everything the Revolution had achieved. Washington received reports from correspondents across the country describing the deteriorating situation. In Massachusetts, an armed rebellion led by Daniel Shays, a Revolutionary War veteran, shut down courts to prevent farm foreclosures. Other states seemed on the verge of similar upheavals. The Union was coming apart. In 1787, a convention was called in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. Virginia appointed Washington as one of its delegates. He was reluctant to attend. He had promised himself and Martha that he was retired from public life. He was 55 years old, suffering from rheumatism and increasingly deaf in one ear. He wanted to be left alone. But James Madison convinced him that his presence was essential. The convention would have no credibility without Washington. The states would not ratify any document that Washington had not endorsed. Like it or not, his name still carried enormous weight. Washington arrived in Philadelphia in May 1787 and was immediately elected president of the convention. For the next 4 months he presided over debates that would produce the Constitution of the United States. He said almost nothing during the deliberations. That was not his role. He maintained order, ensured that all voices were heard, and lent the authority of his presence to the proceedings. But his silence was not indifference. He listened carefully to every argument, and when the convention finally produced a draft constitution, Washington threw his full support behind it. The document created a strong federal government with 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. It gave the federal government power to tax, to regulate commerce, to maintain an army and navy. And it created a single executive, a president, who would serve as head of state and commander-in-chief. Everyone in the room knew who that first president would be. The Constitution was drafted with George Washington in mind. The powers it granted to the executive were powers the delegates trusted Washington to wield. If anyone else had been the presumptive first president, the Constitution might have created a much weaker executive branch. The Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787, and sent to the states for ratification. Washington returned to Mount Vernon, hoping that his work was finally done. But when the Constitution was ratified and the first presidential election was held in 1789, the result was never in doubt. The Electoral College cast its ballots, and George Washington was elected unanimously. Every single elector voted for him. It would be the only unanimous presidential election in American history. Washington received the news at Mount Vernon with something close to dread. He wrote to a friend, "My movements to the chair of government will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution." He didn't want to be president, but duty called again, and he had never refused duty. On April 16, 1789, George Washington left Mount Vernon for New York City, the temporary capital, to be inaugurated as the first president of the United States. He would not return home for more than a year. The presidency. On April 30, 1789, George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City and took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. He wore a suit of brown broadcloth manufactured in Connecticut, a deliberate choice to support American industry. His hair was powdered white in the fashion of the day, tied back in a queue. The oath was administered by Robert Livingston, Chancellor of New York. Washington placed his hand on a Bible and repeated the words, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." Then, unrehearsed and unscripted, he added 4 words, "So help me God." He bent and kissed the Bible. The crowd that had gathered in the streets erupted in cheers. Church bells rang across the city. America had a president. Washington understood that everything he did would set a precedent. There was no handbook for being president, no traditions to follow, no established protocols. Every decision would establish a pattern that future presidents might feel bound to follow. He approached the task with characteristic caution. He consulted constantly with his cabinet, which he established as an advisory body even though the Constitution did not explicitly create one. He appointed brilliant men with opposing viewpoints: Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Henry Knox as Secretary of War. The conflicts between Hamilton and Jefferson would define the political divisions of the early republic. Hamilton wanted a strong federal government, a national bank, and close ties with Britain. Jefferson favoured limited federal power, agrarian democracy, and sympathy with revolutionary France. Washington tried to balance between them, often siding with Hamilton on economic policy while agreeing with Jefferson on foreign affairs. He established the principle that the president could remove cabinet officers without Senate approval, a power the Constitution did not clearly grant, but which Washington asserted and Congress accepted. He created the tradition of delivering an annual message to Congress, what would become the State of the Union address. He insisted on being called simply Mr. President, rejecting more grandiose titles like Your Highness or Your Excellency that some suggested. He held formal receptions but tried to avoid the appearance of monarchical court life. He was creating not just an office but a Republican conception of executive power. The challenges were enormous. The national debt from the Revolutionary War was crushing. State debts were equally severe. Hamilton proposed that the federal government assume all state debts, a controversial plan that Jefferson opposed. Washington backed Hamilton, and the Assumption Act passed in exchange for a compromise that located the permanent capital on the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia. Foreign policy proved even more difficult. In 1793, revolutionary France and Britain went to war. France demanded American support under the terms of the 1778 alliance. Many Americans wanted to help France. Jefferson sympathized with the French Revolution, seeing it as an extension of America's own struggle for liberty. But Washington knew that America could not survive a war with Britain. The young nation had no navy, a tiny army, and an economy dependent on British trade. He issued a proclamation of neutrality, declaring that the United States would remain neutral in the European conflict. The decision was politically costly. Jefferson resigned from the cabinet in protest. Pro-French Democratic Republican societies denounced Washington as a traitor to Republican principles. For the first time in his life, Washington faced sustained public criticism, and it wounded him deeply. The crisis worsened with the Jay Treaty in 1794. John Jay negotiated an agreement with Britain that resolved some outstanding issues from the Revolutionary War, but granted significant concessions to British interests. The treaty was deeply unpopular, denounced in the streets, burned in effigy. Washington was called a tool of British interests, a monarchist, even a traitor. But Washington supported the treaty because the alternative was war, and he knew America could not win such a war. He threw his full prestige behind ratification, and the Senate narrowly approved it. The treaty kept America at peace, even as it cost Washington much of the popularity he had enjoyed. Through it all, Washington maintained his dignity and his commitment to duty. He served 2 terms as president, establishing the 2-term precedent that would hold until Franklin Roosevelt. He could have been elected to a 3rd term, probably unanimously. The people still revered him despite the political controversies, but he was exhausted, aging, and desperate to go home. In September 1796, he published his farewell address, announcing that he would not seek re-election. The address, drafted with Hamilton's assistance, warned against political parties, foreign entanglements, and sectionalism. It became one of the founding documents of American political thought. On March 4, 1797, Washington attended the inauguration of John Adams, the 2nd president. Then he climbed into his carriage and left Philadelphia, the capital, for the last time. He was finally going home to Mount Vernon, to Martha, to the life he'd been trying to return to for more than 20 years. He was 65 years old. He had less than 3 years left to live. The final days, the last years of George Washington's life, were spent in the peace he had craved for so long. He rose early each morning, usually around 5 o'clock, and rode out to inspect his 5 farms, checking on crops, slaves, livestock, and the endless maintenance that a plantation required. He dined at 3 in the afternoon, usually with guests, for Mount Vernon had become a destination for travelers from across America and Europe. He was aging visibly now. His hair was completely white. His face, never handsome, had grown lined and weathered. He had lost most of his teeth over the years, and the ill-fitting dentures he wore, made from ivory and human teeth, not wood as the myth claimed, gave his face a sunken appearance and made speaking difficult. His hearing was poor. His body ached from decades of physical labour and military campaigns, but his mind remained sharp, and his devotion to Mount Vernon was complete. He experimented with crop rotation, trying to restore soil exhausted by decades of tobacco cultivation. He planned elaborate improvements to the mansion and grounds. He managed the labour of more than 300 enslaved people across his farms, buying, selling and allocating their work with the same attention to detail he had brought to military logistics. The question of slavery weighed on him more heavily in these final years. He had owned slaves his entire adult life. His wealth was built on their forced labour. Mount Vernon operated because enslaved men, women and children worked from dawn to dusk without compensation. But something had changed in Washington during the Revolution. He had commanded black soldiers who fought for American freedom. He had absorbed Enlightenment ideas about human rights and natural equality. He had seen the contradiction between proclaiming liberty and owning human beings. In private correspondence, he expressed discomfort with slavery. He said he wished to see it abolished, but he did nothing to free his own slaves during his lifetime, constrained by debts, by social pressure, and by his desire not to separate enslaved families, since many of the Mount Vernon slaves were married to people owned by Martha through the Custis estate and could not legally be freed. In 1799, as he drafted his will, Washington made a decision that would be his final public statement on the question. He ordered that all 123 slaves that he personally owned be freed upon Martha's death. It was the largest private emancipation in Virginia history to that point, but it came only after his death, and it freed less than half the enslaved people at Mount Vernon. The autumn of 1799 brought early cold. Washington continued his daily rides despite the weather, refusing to let age or discomfort keep him from his routines. On December 12th, he rode out to inspect his farms in snow and freezing rain. He returned home with snow hanging from his hair and his neck wet from melting ice. He came directly to dinner without changing his damp clothes, not wanting to keep his guests waiting. That night, he woke Martha sometime after midnight, complaining of a sore throat and difficulty breathing. By morning his condition had worsened. His throat was swelling and he could barely speak. Martha wanted to send for a doctor immediately, but Washington, always concerned for others, told her to wait until morning so the servants would not have to ride out in the cold darkness. The death of the father, Dr. James Craik, Washington's personal physician and friend since the French and Indian War, arrived at Mount Vernon on the morning of December 14, 1799. What he found alarmed him. Washington's throat was severely swollen. He could barely breathe, barely swallow, barely speak. The former president was suffocating. 2 other physicians were summoned, Dr. Gustavus Brown and Dr. Elisha Dick. They consulted, examined Washington, and prescribed the standard treatments of the era. They blistered his throat with hot irons to draw out inflammation. They gave him purgatives to clear his system, and most significantly, they bled him. Bloodletting was considered essential medical practice in 1799. The theory was that draining blood would reduce inflammation and restore the body's balance of humours. Over the course of the day, the physicians removed approximately 80 ounces of Washington's blood, nearly 40% of his total volume. Modern medical analysis suggests Washington was suffering from acute bacterial epiglottitis, an infection and swelling of the tissue around the trachea. The bloodletting, rather than helping, almost certainly hastened his death by inducing shock and preventing his body from fighting the infection. Washington understood he was dying. He had faced death too many times not to recognize its approach. Between treatments, he gave instructions to his secretary, Tobias Lear, about his papers and his affairs. He reviewed his will one last time. He asked Martha to bring him 2 versions of the document and, after examining them, indicated which one should be followed. His last request was simple and specific. "I find I'm going," he told Lear. "Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 3 days after I am dead." The fear of being buried alive was common in an age when death was not always easy to confirm. He wanted to be certain. Lear nodded and promised. Washington asked, "Do you understand me?" Lear replied that he did. Washington's final words were, "'Tis well." At approximately 10:01 p.m. on December 14, 1799, George Washington stopped breathing. His physician felt for a pulse, found none, and looked at Martha. She stood by the bed, composed, silent. She had been married to George Washington for 40 years. She had shared his triumphs and his struggles, his years of war and his years of peace. Now she was a widow. Martha Washington asked only one question: "Is he gone?" When told yes, she said simply, "All is now over. I shall soon follow him. I have no more trials to pass through." Tobias Lear closed Washington's eyes. The servants were called to prepare the body. News was sent to Alexandria, to Mount Vernon's neighbours, and to the government in Philadelphia. The first President of the United States, the commander who had won independence, the man who had twice surrendered power rather than grasp it, was dead at 67 years old. The funeral. George Washington's body lay in state at Mount Vernon for 3 days, as he had requested, in a mahogany coffin in the large dining room. Visitors came to pay their respects. Neighbours, former soldiers, slaves who had served him for decades, strangers who travelled miles just to see the great man one final time. On December 18th, 1799, the funeral was held at Mount Vernon. It was a cold, grey day. The ceremony was Masonic, as Washington had been a Freemason for most of his adult life. The Reverend Thomas Davis of Alexandria delivered a brief service. There were no lengthy eulogies, no grand speeches. Washington had requested simplicity. The procession to the family vault was short, just a few hundred yards from the mansion. Military honours were rendered by militia units from Alexandria. A schooner on the Potomac fired minute guns. The Masons performed their ritual, and George Washington's body was placed in the old family vault on a hillside overlooking the river he had loved. Martha Washington did not attend. It was not customary for women to attend funerals in that era, and she watched from a window of the mansion as her husband was laid to rest. She would live another 2.5 years, dying on May 22, 1802. In accordance with Washington's will, the 123 slaves he owned were freed on January 1, 1801, a year after his death. Martha could not bear to wait until her own death, fearing that the slaves might murder her to hasten their freedom. News of Washington's death spread slowly across the nation. In an era before telegraph or railroad, it took days for word to reach the farther states. But when it did, the entire country went into mourning. Congress adjourned, businesses closed, churches held memorial services, people wore black armbands, mock funerals were staged in cities across America, elaborate ceremonies with empty coffins, military processions, and eulogies praising the fallen leader. The most famous eulogy was delivered by Henry Light Horse Harry Lee, Washington's former cavalry commander, who told Congress on December 26, 1799, "First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, He was second to none in humble and enduring scenes of private life, pious, just, humane, temperate, and sincere, uniform, dignified, and commanding. His example was as edifying to all around him as were the effects of that example lasting. The phrase, "first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen," would become immortal, capturing in a single sentence what Washington had meant to his nation. The legacy. George Washington has been dead for more than 225 years. The world he knew is gone, swept away by revolutions industrial, technological, and social that he could never have imagined. Yet his presence remains everywhere in American life. The capital of the United States bears his name, a city that did not exist during his lifetime, but which was built where it is because of a political compromise he facilitated. The Washington Monument, completed in 1884, dominates the Capitol's skyline, a 555-foot marble obelisk that remains the tallest structure in the District of Columbia. One of the 50 states is named Washington, the only state named for a president. Counties in 31 states bear his name. Towns and cities named Washington exist in almost every state. George Washington University, Washington University in St. Louis, the University of Washington, and countless other schools carry his name. His face appears on the $1 bill and the quarter, making him one of the most reproduced images in human history. Every time an American makes a purchase, Washington's likeness changes hands. His birthday, February 22nd, combined with Lincoln's birthday into President's Day, is a federal holiday. But the physical monuments are less important than the precedents he established and the model of leadership he created. Washington proved that Republican government could work on a continental scale, that a revolution could produce not chaos and tyranny, but ordered liberty. He demonstrated that military power could be subordinate to civilian authority, that a victorious general could refuse a crown and return to private life. He showed that executive power could be exercised with restraint, that a president could serve his term and voluntarily relinquish office. The peaceful transfer of power from Washington to Adams in 1797 and from Adams to Jefferson in 1801 established a pattern that has held for more than 2 centuries, surviving civil war, world wars, and countless political crises. His farewell address, warning against permanent foreign alliances and domestic political factions, shaped American foreign policy for more than a century. The Monroe Doctrine, the policy of non-intervention in European affairs, was a direct extension of Washington's warnings. His creation of the cabinet as an advisory body to the president became a fundamental part of American governance. His assertion of executive privilege, his negotiation of treaties, his command of military forces, all established precedents that define the presidency as an institution. But Washington's legacy is also complicated by contradictions that he never resolved. He fought for liberty while owning slaves. He proclaimed that all men were created equal while treating enslaved people as property. He freed his own slaves only after his death, when it cost him nothing, and even then freed only those he personally owned, not those who belonged to the Custis estate that his wife brought to the marriage. Modern Americans wrestling with the history of slavery and its enduring effects must confront the fact that the father of the country was himself a slaveholder who benefited from forced labor his entire life. No amount of military genius or political wisdom can erase that fact. Washington was not a saint, and he would have been uncomfortable with the quasi-religious veneration he received even in his own lifetime. He was a man, flawed and limited by the prejudices of his age, who nonetheless rose to extraordinary challenges with a combination of courage, integrity, and selflessness that remains worthy of admiration. He wanted above all to be left alone to farm his land and live in peace. Instead, he spent decades in public service, sacrificing his health, his comfort, and his happiness, because he believed that duty demanded it. He never sought power, but he wielded it when necessary, and he surrendered it when the moment came. That final act, the voluntary surrender of power, may be his greatest legacy. In a world where victorious generals became emperors and revolutionary leaders became tyrants, Washington went home to his farm. He showed that power was a burden to be endured, not a prize to be grasped. He demonstrated that the true measure of a leader was not in taking power, but in knowing when to give it up. The current Queen Elizabeth II is descended from George III, the king Washington fought against. The sitting President of the United States, whoever holds that office, exercises powers that exist because Washington established their constitutional limits. The peaceful transfer of power that happens every 4 or 8 years happens because Washington made it happen first. Every time a military officer salutes a civilian president, every time a general retires to private life, every time power changes hands without violence, George Washington's influence continues. The institutions he helped create, the precedents he established, the model of leadership he embodied, these are his true monuments. At Mount Vernon, in a brick tomb that replaced the old family vault in 1831, George and Martha Washington rest side by side. The plantation is now a museum, visited by hundreds of thousands of people each year who come to see where the father of the country lived and died. The view from the portico at Mount Vernon looks out over the Potomac River, the same view Washington saw every morning when he stepped outside. The river flows as it always has, constant and unchanging, while the nation he helped create has grown from 13 colonies clinging to the Atlantic seaboard into a continental power that extends across an entire hemisphere and influences the entire world. Washington could not have imagined what America would become, but the principles he fought for, imperfectly applied as they have been, equality before the law, government by consent of the governed, the protection of individual rights, these ideals have spread far beyond the borders of the United States. Simón Bolívar looked to Washington as a model when liberating South America. The French Revolution, for all its excesses, was partly inspired by the American example Washington embodied. Democratic movements across the world, from Europe to Asia to Africa, have drawn on the precedent that Washington helped establish, that people can govern themselves, that power belongs to the people, and that leaders serve at the people's pleasure, not by divine right. The man who never wanted to be famous became one of the most famous men in history. The man who wanted only to farm his land became the symbol of a new kind of nation. The man who doubted his own abilities proved indispensable to the creation of a country that has endured for more than 2 centuries. If this journey through George Washington's life has given you something to think about, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know in the comments which moment in Washington's story resonates most with you, or what surprised you about the man behind the myth. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. George Washington lies at Mount Vernon, overlooking the river he loved. The nation he helped create endures, transformed beyond recognition from the fragile republic he left behind, yet still shaped by the precedents he established and the model of leadership he created. He was not perfect, he was not a saint, but he was, in the moment when his country needed him most, exactly what was required. A man who valued duty over ambition, who surrendered power rather than grasped it, and who understood that the cause was greater than any individual. The greatest man of his age, some called him. Perhaps. But more importantly, he was a man who knew when to go home. Good night.